She had never seen a man dressed like this. Broad-shouldered, sun-tanned, a bandana knotted at his neck, the cowboy moved with a relaxed rhythm that felt almost rehearsed, like he belonged in a movie, not a prisoner of war camp. But here she was, on the edge of a Texas ranch, surrounded by barbed wire, open fields, and the smell of sizzling pork fat curling into the morning air. A cast-iron skillet hissed over a fire pit as the cowboy used a gloved hand to dish out eggs into tin plates. No shouting, no barked orders, just the distant whinny of a horse and the murmur of "Mornin', miss." The food smelled rich. She felt dizzy, overwhelmed by hunger and something stranger, the realization that the enemy had fed her. And not just fed her, but smiled. The war had warned her about Americans. Nothing, not even survival, had prepared her for this. The train screeched across the dry land like a dying animal. For hours, maybe days, the women had sat packed into the stifling metal car, shoulders pressed tight, sweat pooling in the curve of their backs. They didn't speak. Some prayed quietly, others stared at the floor, refusing to meet each other's eyes. Outside, the view was alien. Flat stretches of tan earth rolled endlessly past, broken only by mesquite trees and the flicker of jackrabbits bounding into the brush. Texas. They didn't know the name then. They only knew the heat, the silence, and the strange, endless sky. When the train finally groaned to a halt, a hush fell over the car like a held breath. The doors slid open. Sunlight, hot and unrelenting, poured in, blinding them. The women blinked against it, coughing as dust kicked up into their throats. A soldier barked something in English. The sound had no meaning, but the intent was clear. Move. One by one the women stepped down, their shoes crunching on sun-baked gravel. They expected the world to fall in on them, for rifles to rise, for hands to shove. Instead, there was only heat and the low murmur of men's voices. They had imagined arrival as humiliation. That was the story, the warning, the vow whispered into ears since the first lessons of war. Bushido had told them that capture was worse than death, that the Americans would not see women, only enemies. They would be stripped, paraded, spat on, and discarded. Their bodies would become battlegrounds. And yet, what met them here on this unfamiliar ranch was not violence, but protocol. A row of Americans stood near the gate, cowboy hats slouched low, rifles slung casually, not aggressively. Their shirts were sweat-stained. Some wore boots dusted in red earth. They did not leer. They did not laugh. They didn't even look angry. The Japanese women shifted uncertainly, blinking at the surreal stillness. Was this a trick? One of them whispered the thought, but her voice was so thin it vanished in the breeze. Then came the unexpected smell: hay, leather, manure, and beneath it, smoke. Cooking smoke. Somewhere someone was frying something. Her stomach twisted violently. It couldn't be. It smelled like pork. They were marched, not driven, up a dirt road that opened into a wide clearing. The camp, if it could even be called that, was not like the ones they had feared. No gray concrete towers, no snarling dogs or floodlights, just low wooden buildings, a wire fence, a few watchtowers. Cows lowed in the distance. A horse whinnied. There were men on horseback. Actual men, on horseback. The ranch was both prison and mirage. One woman, no older than 20, nearly fainted at the sight of a stable. Her last post had been on a hospital ship bombed off Okinawa. She had seen limbs blown open and boys screaming for their mothers. Now she stood here in the middle of a scene that looked more like a postcard than a prison. It was unbearable in its contradiction. The Americans spoke little Japanese, but their tone was not mocking. Instead, they gestured toward barracks with flat palms, voices firm but not raised. Inside, the women found rows of cots, buckets of fresh water, and, impossibly, a pile of clean linens. A few broke into tears, not because they were comforted, but because they didn't know what to do with kindness. Outside, a cowboy with a red bandana knelt to fix a broken fence. He looked up as the women passed and tipped his hat. It meant nothing to them, and yet it did. The gesture landed in the hollow space where hatred had been expected. One woman turned away quickly, not out of fear, but shame, because for the first time since surrendering, she felt her body unclench. No one had shouted at them. No one had hit them. The sun had scorched their faces, but it was the warmth of a sky, not a punishment. That night, as they lay on their cots listening to the strange chorus of cicadas and the distant bark of dogs, one of them whispered, "This cannot be real." Another replied, "Then what is it?" They did not yet know. But the fire they had been thrown into had not burned them. It had only begun to melt something frozen within. They woke at dawn to the clang of a bell and the scent of something frying in oil. The light poured in through slatted windows, golden and clean, catching the dust in the air like it was trying to show them beauty in motion. For a moment they forgot where they were. Then came the sound of boots outside, calm, not hurried, and the low hum of a voice singing in English, off-key and slow. A cowboy, one of the Americans, singing like the world wasn't at war. The sky above them was vast, uncaged, a canvas of pale blue stretching far beyond the barbed wire fence that ringed the perimeter. It made no sense. How could captivity exist under a sky so open? The wire glinted in the morning sun, sharp and real, but it framed not a concrete yard or a fortress, but rolling fields dotted with oak trees and grazing cattle. One of the women, the one who had once stitched wounds in a bunker beneath Osaka, stared out at the horses moving freely beyond the fences and felt the disorienting sensation of being less imprisoned than misplaced. This place was not a prison. It was a contradiction, and it terrified her. They filed into a mess hall, if it could be called that, built of sturdy timber and smelling like something impossible. Breakfast. Not rice, not miso broth. No, this was the smell of butter and smoke, of bread rising in ovens, and the unmistakable, scandalous scent of bacon. Some women gasped. Others froze in place. The guards, or cowboys, or whatever they were, stood behind the counters, ladling food with quiet efficiency. No shouting, no laughter, just the clink of plates and the low scrape of boots across wood. They were handed trays, real trays, and on them, eggs, fluffy and steaming, thick slices of bacon curled and crisp, warm biscuits split open like soft clouds and drizzled with honey, and a cup of something dark and bitter, coffee, actual coffee, not a roasted barley substitute, not sludge, the real thing. No one moved. Hunger wrestled with disbelief. One woman, hands shaking, stared down at her food as if waiting for it to vanish. Another muttered, "It's a trick," but her voice was hollow. The nurse, the same one who had flinched at kindness the day before, picked up her fork and took a bite of egg. She chewed once, twice, then covered her mouth with her hand as tears welled without warning. She wasn't crying because the food was good. She was crying because she hadn't remembered it could be. Around them the guards moved without menace. One leaned against a support beam, chewing something, tobacco maybe, and watching the prisoners eat with what looked like mild curiosity. Another tipped his hat when one of the women dropped her spoon and muttered, "Ma'am." The word stung. It didn't sound sarcastic. That was the problem. None of this was cruel. None of this made sense. Later that morning, when they were led outside to stretch or walk, the women passed two of the cowboys standing near the corral. One of the men was mending a rope. The other offered a wave, not friendly, but not hostile either. It was the kind of wave a neighbor might give. And the women, still clutching the weight of eggs in their stomachs, didn't know where to put that gesture. It didn't fit inside the world they had come from. Some tried to cling to their expectations. This was all performance, they said to each other in whispers. It would end. The cruelty would come later. This had to be manipulation, but even that explanation began to fray. There were no jeers, no punishments, no games, only quiet men with dust on their boots and rifles they didn't seem eager to use. By midday, the Texas sun was beating down hard, and a few women were offered straw hats to shield their faces. The gesture was so absurdly domestic that one of them laughed, a short, stunned sound she immediately stifled. Laughter wasn't allowed, not in war, and certainly not in defeat, and yet here they were, drinking water from tin cups and watching a cowboy lead a horse across the paddock. He called the animal Miss June, spoke to it like a friend. And as the women sat in silence, chewing slowly, the edges of their certainty began to crumble. This place shouldn't exist. It defied the story. And that was the most dangerous thing of all. The second morning, the eggs tasted like guilt. It sat heavy on their tongues, not because the food was bad, it was impossibly good, but because it came from hands they were meant to hate. Some of the women cried while eating, silent tears slipping down cheeks as they swallowed bite after bite, ashamed of their hunger. One woman, a former radio operator with wrists still bruised from a forced march weeks earlier, tried to chew slowly, as if pacing herself could lessen the betrayal. But when she caught herself reaching for the last piece of bacon with trembling fingers, she froze. She dropped it back on the plate like it had burned her. At a table near the window, another woman held her biscuit without eating it. She just stared at the flaky layers pulling apart in her hand. Her mother had died in a Tokyo hospital with only rice water for meals. Her younger brother had written, months before she was captured, that his school now gave children a quarter slice of dried fish once a week, if they were lucky. And here she sat, full to the edge of shame. The quiet of the mess hall was thick. No one spoke above a whisper. No one dared express thanks. Gratitude would feel like treason. The food, they told themselves, was not nourishment. It was surrender. One woman refused to eat altogether, sitting stiffly with her tray untouched, her jaw clenched so tight her muscles quivered. A cowboy passed behind her with a coffee pot and asked softly, "You want more?" She didn't understand the words, but the tone made her flinch. He moved on without waiting for a reply. Afterward, some women tucked food into their skirts or boots, hoarding scraps like they had in the jungle camps, not out of necessity, but out of reflex. Others cleaned their trays so thoroughly it looked as if they were polished. The contradiction was unbearable. They were being fed more by their captors than they had been by their own commanders, and it was not just food, it was warmth. It was care. And it made them feel like traitors to everything they'd believed. The memories of hunger were not distant. They were bone deep. They remembered boiling grass for soup. They remembered standing in ration lines that stretched down entire streets. One recalled chewing newspapers soaked in salt water just to have something in her stomach. Another, thinner than the rest, had once been assigned to a supply unit that received boxes of canned meat meant for the front, only to open them and find they were filled with straw. Starvation had become a ritual, a constant. To eat now, to feel full, was to confront the question, had all that suffering been in vain? The suspicion lingered. The food must be drugged, some said. It was a trap. Fatten them up, then humiliate them. One whispered that the Americans were trying to break their minds by making their bodies feel safe. And yet, no punishments followed. No sudden beatings, no change in tone. The guards, the cowboys, just kept bringing the food like it meant nothing. In the evenings, some women lay awake gripping their blankets, stomachs turning not from poison, but from confusion. One sat up suddenly, panicked, convinced the stew had been laced with something. She vomited in a bucket, sobbing with shame, even as others tried to comfort her. The next morning, the same stew was served again. She ate it, slowly, eyes closed. These meals were not merely meals. They were confrontations. Each spoonful chipped away at something internal, a belief, a wall, a wound. And though no one spoke of it openly, they all knew. Food was supposed to be survival. Here, it had become something else entirely. It had become a question they couldn't yet answer. The answer had once been drilled into them so thoroughly they could recite it in sleep. In classrooms that smelled of chalk and disinfectant, beneath banners stitched with imperial symbols, they had learned that surrender was not a fate, but a stain. To be captured meant to erase one's name, one's lineage, one's place in the story of the nation. Better to die, better to vanish into ash. That was what had been fed to them long before they ever tasted American eggs or Texas coffee. The lessons had never been gentle. Officers paced between rows of young women in stiff uniforms, voices sharp as bayonets. They spoke of honor as if it were a blade to be held at the throat. They spoke of Americans as beasts, men without restraint, driven by appetite and cruelty. To be taken by them was to be defiled. Shame, they said, would follow them home like a plague. Shame was described not as a feeling but as a contagion, a rot that would infect families, villages, bloodlines. And so the fear of disgrace became stronger than the fear of death. It had worked. Even now, under the Texas sky, the old teachings clung like smoke. When a guard held a door open for them, they lowered their eyes. When food was served with a quiet nod, they turned stiff, refusing to smile. To accept kindness felt like dissolving in acid. Strength, they had been taught, was silence. Strength was endurance of pain, not comfort. Strength was obedience, not life. But this captivity did not resemble the warnings. There were no cages of bamboo, no starvation rations, no beatings in the yard. They were given soap, blankets, time. It scraped against everything they had known, and that was what unsettled them most. The softness did not feel like relief. It felt like erosion. At night, the ghosts came, not in the form of apparitions, but memories, faces of women who had chosen the blade instead of capture, a medic from the Philippines who had swallowed poison when surrounded, a nurse who had walked calmly into artillery fire rather than be taken. They remembered the quiet resolve in their eyes, the certainty. Those women had been praised as pure, as unbroken, as loyal. Now here they lay, alive, full-stomached, listening to insects hum beyond the fence. Each breath felt borrowed. Some tried to harden themselves again. They avoided looking at the guards. They ate quickly, without tasting. They refused blankets at first, pretending to be cold would shame them. One woman slept on the wooden floor below her cot for 3 nights, saying softness would corrupt her spirit. Another washed her mouth after every meal, as if scrubbing evidence from her body. And yet, hunger and cold and exhaustion wear ideology thin. When a cowboy handed one of them a cup of warm coffee on a particularly cold morning, her fingers closed around it before she could stop herself. The warmth spread into her palms, through her wrists, up her arms. She wanted to throw it away. She didn't. That moment stayed with her more than any lecture she had ever received. They did not write home. They were allowed paper, pencils. Some even saw women in other compounds scribbling lines under supervision. But their hands froze when it came time to try. What could they say? That they were alive? That they were being treated well? Such sentences felt like betrayals written in ink. They imagined their mothers reading the letters in bombed-out kitchens, imagined brothers still fighting, hungry and ragged. How could they speak of biscuits and blankets? So the letters remained blank. Instead, the thoughts turned inward. Were they weak for surviving? Or had the empire demanded too much? The question gnawed. Every kindness reopened it, every clean bandage, every shared look from a guard that did not contain hatred. One night, a woman finally spoke what others had only dared think. She had been an assistant in a naval hospital. She had seen hundreds die without surrender. She whispered into the dark, voice shaking, "If dying proves loyalty, what does living prove?" No one answered. The question lingered. Outside, a cowboy's voice drifted from the porch as he hummed some slow, wandering tune. It was not military. It carried no anthem. It was simply a man being alive. And lying there, listening, the women could feel the doctrine of steel beginning to bend. Not break, but bend. And they did not yet know which direction it would snap. The next morning, a woman sneezed during roll call, and the cowboy leading it paused, reached into his coat pocket, and handed her a handkerchief. She stared at it like it was made of fire. He gave a small, awkward shrug, then moved on without a word. The handkerchief sat in her hand, soft and absurdly clean, and in that moment the war felt like a dream from another world. That was how the shift began, not with speeches or orders, but with gestures so small they almost slipped by unnoticed. Another woman, whose boot sole had split down the center, tried to walk without limping, afraid that weakness might invite mockery or worse. A guard noticed. That evening, a pair of calloused hands knocked on the door of her barrack and wordlessly offered her a stitched repair job, already done. She took the boot, nodded stiffly, and closed the door. She cried that night, not because she was afraid, but because the kindness had no name, no logic, and no price. It simply was. Each day, the guards, cowboys, some called them, passed through their lives with casual courtesy. They didn't leer. They didn't laugh cruelly. They offered seconds at meals. They asked occasionally if the women needed more water or help carrying buckets. One even caught a chicken that had escaped its pen and brought it back gently, tucked under one arm, grinning like a boy on a farm. These weren't the monsters they had been warned about. These were men, simple, dusty, tired, and human. One night the women heard music. It wasn't from a gramophone or a loudspeaker. It came from the center of the camp, where the fire pit crackled low beneath the stars. A cowboy sat on a stump with a harmonica pressed to his lips, playing a slow, unsteady tune. It was neither cheerful nor mournful, just quiet. Something meant for himself, not for an audience. But the women heard it. They leaned toward the windows, drawn by the sound. It wasn't a song of war. It wasn't triumph. It was something older, something that rose from the dirt and dust of this place and made them ache for things they didn't have words for. No one said a word. One woman closed her eyes and imagined a field outside Kyoto. Another saw her father's hands tending to a plum tree. Another simply let herself feel, for the first time in months, the ache of being alive without a mission. The tune ended, and silence returned like a blanket. The confusion thickened. They began to notice how the Americans looked them in the eye, not with challenge, not with disdain, but with something quieter. Recognition, perhaps, or curiosity. The absence of hatred was its own kind of burden. These were the men they had been taught would defile them. Yet when one woman dropped a bowl in the mess hall, the nearest cowboy bent down beside her, helped her gather the shards, and said softly, "No problem." She didn't understand the words, but the tone, gentle, unhurried, cut through the air like a knife. How could the enemy be kind? How could a man in boots and a broad hat, who had probably never seen a city bombed into ash, treat them with more decency than some of their own officers? The thought gnawed at them. Some tried to retreat into silence again. They avoided the guards' eyes. They ate mechanically. They reminded themselves with clenched teeth that it was all an illusion. But their bodies remembered the warmth. Their hands remembered the help. Their ears remembered the music. The cowboy's smile, the one offered without demand, without suspicion, without calculation, it stayed with them, because it asked nothing, and that, more than cruelty ever could, began to unravel everything they thought they knew. The first assignment came with the rising sun, not a barking order, not a threat, just a quiet instruction and a gesture toward the fields. The women followed, still half expecting it to dissolve into humiliation. Instead, they were handed tools, rakes, buckets, cloths, simple things that carried no violence. Their days filled with labor, honest, aching labor. They mended fences under a wide sky that never seemed to end. The wire burned hot after noon, searing their palms until calluses began to form. They cleaned stables, shoveling straw mixed with manure, the smell thick and unmistakably alive. It clung to their clothes, their hair, their skin. At first, they recoiled. Then they got used to it. Then, slowly, they stopped thinking of it as filth and began thinking of it as the smell of work. In the kitchens, some were taught how to crack eggs with a single hand, how to flip biscuits in iron pans without burning them, how to stir gravy so it did not clump. An older woman, who had once rationed rice grains by the dozen, stood stunned the first time she saw a barrel of flour stacked against the wall. She had to look away because the sight of abundance made her chest tighten. Out by the corrals, horses stamped against the ground, their hooves kicking dust into the air. A few of the women had never seen a horse outside of a faded schoolbook image. One of the cowboys, his face lined by sun and something heavier, placed a hand on a mare's neck and motioned for a young nurse to do the same. She hesitated. Then slowly she reached out. The horse snorted softly, warm, breathing, alive. She laughed before she realized she had. A quick, startled sound, like her own voice had surprised her. They were taught to plant seeds in rows, to press soil with measured care. When one of the seedlings broke, the same cowboy shrugged and said something in English that sounded like tomorrow. She didn't know the word then, but she understood the meaning. It could be tried again. There were misunderstandings, plenty of them. One woman accidentally salted a pan of biscuits as if she were curing fish. The guards made exaggerated choking sounds when they tasted them, then burst into laughter. It wasn't cruel laughter. It was the kind that carried no edge. She laughed, too, her face burning with embarrassment but also amazement. They had not struck her for wasting food. They just laughed. The language barrier became less of a wall and more of a game. The cowboys tried to mimic Japanese words. They failed terribly. The women, in return, attempted English phrases filtered through heavy accents and hesitation. "Good mornin'," one practiced each day. A guard tipped his hat every time she said it. It became a ritual, small, repetitive, safe. And so the routine built itself. Wake with the sun, work until noon, a meal without fear, more labor. Then evening, when the light softened and the air cooled, and the tension receded like distant thunder. No one announced this transformation. There was no moment when resistance formally surrendered. It just thinned, gradually, day by day, thread by thread. They began to feel something unfamiliar beneath the fatigue. Usefulness. Not service to an emperor or obedience to cruelty, but the simple act of doing something that produced a result. A repaired fence. A filled trough. A baked loaf. The body works, and the world responds. They had forgotten that cycle existed outside of war. One afternoon a woman bent double from scrubbing floors, straightened, and said, almost to herself, "My hands feel strong again." No one corrected her. No one told her that strength was only found in sacrifice or death. Her words hung there, fragile but true. In the evenings they sat with sore muscles and dust still clinging to their skin, watching the sky darken into deep indigo. And the strangest part was this: the work had not broken them. It had steadied them. Not because they were free, not because the war was gone, but because for a few hours each day they were no longer only prisoners. They were workers. They were helpers. They were women who lifted, planted, stirred, mended. And in that strange, sun-soaked routine, without anyone declaring it, resistance softened into presence. The first shower was silent, not because of fear, but because of reverence. They had expected cold hoses, maybe even mockery. Instead, they were handed towels, real ones, and small wrapped bars of soap that smelled faintly of lavender. They were shown to stalls with curtains, clean floors, even warm water. As steam rose and droplets slid down tired backs, they did not speak. The act of washing became something more than hygiene. It was a kind of restoration. For some, it was the first time in months they'd seen their skin without layers of grime and sweat and memory clinging to it. One woman, standing beneath the stream, rubbed the soap between her hands and watched the bubbles form like a dream. Her fingers trembled. She remembered a river in Nagano, long before the war, when she'd bathed with her younger sister. They had giggled, splashed, scrubbed each other's backs. That memory had felt unreachable until this moment, beneath this water, in a place she never imagined she'd survive, let alone feel human again. Afterward, the guards didn't leer. They didn't ask questions. They simply nodded and returned to their routines. For the women, the experience was something they didn't know how to name. Dignity, perhaps. Or maybe grace. That same evening, a voice rose near the fire pit. It was not English, not loud, but it carried. One of the women, a seamstress before the war, began to hum, then sing. A lullaby her grandmother had sung to her, soft and rhythmic, born from mountains and rice fields and centuries of peace before war ever came. Her voice cracked midway through, not from weakness, but because it had been so long since anyone had sung without fear. A few of the women joined in, shyly, their voices building like wind through trees. The melody was foreign to the men gathered nearby, but they didn't interrupt. One cowboy, the same who played the harmonica, simply sat with his hat in his lap, watching the fire. When the song ended, he whispered something, maybe thanks, maybe nothing, and gave a small nod. That was all. No applause, no intrusion, just presence, and that was more powerful than any recognition. The next morning, during work detail, a guard handed a stack of envelopes and pencils to the women. "Write home," he said in slow English, tapping his chest and miming a letter with his hands. Some of the women stared in disbelief. Others looked away, fear tightening their jaws. A few took the paper and held it like a secret. The permission to write was both a gift and a wound. They gathered that night in their barrack, sitting cross-legged with paper laid before them like a shrine. What to say? What not to say? One woman wrote 3 lines and tore them up. Another stared for an hour before simply writing 4 words in careful script. I am still alive. It was enough. It was everything. No politics, no confession, just existence. The knowledge that somewhere a mother or a child might open that letter and know that breath still moved in the chest of someone they loved. That was power beyond any weapon. Others followed cautiously. A letter to a sister, a line to a cousin. They wrote with trembling hands, not because they feared the Americans would punish them, but because it was the first time they had been allowed to tell the truth, that they had been captured, and yet they had not been broken. These small things, soap, song, letters, did not end the war. They did not undo the past, but they formed cracks in the wall between enemy and human, not large ones, just enough to let light through. And when that light touched their skin, they realized they were not ghosts of a failed empire. They were women, still breathing, still singing, still writing their names into the world. The replies came slower than the letters they had sent, carried across oceans and ruins, through hands that had learned to tremble before they learned to hope. When the first envelope arrived, worn at the edges and smudged with soil, the barracks fell silent. No one spoke. No one dared to reach for it. It lay on the table like an unexploded shell. The woman whose name it bore was a cook's assistant before the war, a girl who had once been proud of how quickly she could dice daikon. Her fingers hovered over the paper as if the ink itself might burn. When she finally opened it, she read with her head bowed, lips moving soundlessly. Her mother's handwriting was thinner than she remembered. Bent. The letter was short, as if paper and breath had become equally scarce. There was talk of ration lines that ended before they began, of neighbors boiling weeds and old leather boots, of children fainting in schoolyards, of rice turned to luxury, of rice husks ground into flour, of soups made from grass and rainwater. There were names of the dead, neighbors, cousins, her uncle, and at the bottom a sentence that did not accuse, but cut deeper than any accusation could. "We are glad you still live, even if we live this way." She folded the letter and pressed it to her chest. Then she began to cry. Not violently, not loudly, just the slow unspooling of grief that had nowhere else to go. Others watched, dread growing like frost. More letters arrived in the days that followed, each one heavier, each one colder. One woman learned her father had vanished during the firebombing of Osaka. Another read that her younger brother walked 3 hours a day for a bowl of watered-down millet. Some letters spoke of entire towns reduced to black dust, entire harvests burned, entire lives erased. And here they were, sleeping on clean sheets, eating eggs and bacon, washing with soap, their stomachs warm while their families starved. The shame did not strike all at once. It crept in. It sat in the body like a second hunger. At breakfast they began to hesitate again, not because they distrusted the food, but because each bite felt heavier now. It was no longer just betrayal of ideology. It was betrayal of blood. One woman pushed away her tray altogether, unable to swallow. Another vomited behind the mess hall, not from sickness, from guilt. "What kind of daughter eats meat?" one whispered, "while her mother drinks boiled roots?" There was no answer. The order of the camp began to collapse inside them. Not outwardly. They still worked. They still followed instructions. But something had splintered beneath the surface. The dignity they had slowly begun to accept now felt like a stolen dress worn over bones. At night, instead of songs, there were only murmurs. Have I betrayed them? By surviving? By eating? By letting them be kind? The questions drifted through the dark like smoke no wind could move. One woman, the one who had sung by the fire, covered her face and whispered, "What if everything we were told was wrong?" The room froze. That was not a question easily spoken, not even here, not even in safety. But it had been growing inside all of them. What if the Empire needed their deaths more than their lives? What if the stories of American cruelty had been weapons, not truths? What if the shame they were taught to fear had only been a chain? No one answered her, but no one dismissed her either. That silence was the loudest sound they had heard since arriving, and for a moment, outside the story, outside the fences, outside the war, let me ask you something. If this story weighs on you, if it travels into you the way it has traveled with them, take a moment to like this video and leave a comment telling where you're watching from. History survives because people listen. Back inside the camp, the women did not yet know what to do with the truth pressing against them, that their suffering had been prescribed, that their enemy's kindness was not weakness but policy, that their survival was not disgrace but defiance in another form. The worst part was not hunger or fear or captivity. It was standing between two realities, one that had starved their loved ones and one that fed them. And the question that refused to leave them, no matter how many letters they folded, no matter how many prayers they whispered into their pillows, was not whether the Americans were kind. It was whether their own country had ever been. If you enjoyed this story, please like the video and leave a comment below. Tell us where you're watching from. We'd love to hear your thoughts. The announcement came not with explosions, but with static. A shortwave radio in the mess hall crackled to life as the women filed in for morning detail. Most couldn't understand the words, but they recognized the tone. It was the Emperor's voice, tinny, distant, impossibly soft. He had never spoken to the public before, and now, through a veil of signal noise and solemn cadence, he declared what no one had believed possible: surrender. The war was over. No cheers erupted, no hats were thrown, just silence. Thick and stunned. It did not feel like victory. It did not even feel like defeat. It felt like a floor suddenly vanishing beneath their feet. The women looked at each other, as if waiting for someone to explain what came next. No one could. In the days that followed, orders shifted. Guards moved differently. There was talk of repatriation, of ships being readied, of trains scheduled to move them east. And though many had longed for home, the thought of return now stirred more dread than comfort. Because what were they returning to? A burned-out homeland? A family buried in silence? A culture that told them they should have died? And who exactly were they now? They weren't prisoners anymore, but neither were they the women they had once been. The ranch had changed them, not just softened them, but remade them. It had introduced questions they could not unlearn, kindnesses they could not reject, and guilt they could not resolve. The cowboys, too, began to shift. They said little, but their gestures grew quieter, more deliberate. One morning, a guard named Thomas, who always tipped his hat but never spoke more than a word, placed a folded piece of paper on the bench beside one of the women. Inside was a sketch he'd made of the women working in the fields, the wide Texas sky stretched behind them. Her name was written carefully at the bottom, in Roman letters. Another guard, the harmonica player, handed out a pouch of tobacco to one of the older women with a bowed head. "For your father," he said. She didn't understand the words, but she understood the offering. She clutched it like a relic. On the morning of departure, The women were given fresh clothes, not uniforms, not rags, but simple dresses in pale colors. They felt strange against their skin, too clean, too soft. They packed what little they had: soap, letters, sketches, a hairpin gifted by a cook, a small carved figurine from scrap wood. As they boarded the train, the cowboys stood along the platform. No salutes, no speeches, just quiet nods. The same hands that had once locked gates now offered help with suitcases. One woman pressed her forehead briefly to the wooden railing before climbing aboard, as if to say goodbye to a part of herself she couldn't carry back. The train pulled away slowly. Dust kicked up from the tracks, and the ranch grew smaller behind them, until it became only a shape on the horizon. In the train car, no one spoke for a long time. Then someone began to hum, the same lullaby that had once floated through the campfire air. This time, no one shushed her. A few joined in. The melody carried them forward, toward a home that might not feel like home at all. What they carried with them wasn't just survival, it was contradiction. Soap and hunger, music and mourning, names of guards they would never forget, questions they could never ask aloud in the homes they returned to, because when they stepped off that train they would be seen one way, as survivors, perhaps, or as traitors, but never as what they had become, witnesses to the failure of hate and the quiet power of being treated like a person. And that truth, heavy and unspeakable, would remain with them for the rest of their lives. The ship docked without ceremony. No flags, no welcomes. Just a gray sky over a broken harbor, and a silence so deep it felt like the sea had swallowed the world. The women disembarked with their satchels of memories, stepping onto homeland soil that no longer felt like home. Around them, the buildings stood like ghosts. Skeletons of factories, half-sunken roofs, shops scorched and hollowed. In the streets, people moved slowly, as if time itself had lost its rhythm. Some had family waiting, mothers who clutched them without words, brothers who stared too long, as if searching for the soldier they expected to return. One woman's aunt slapped her across the face, then wept into her shoulder. Another was met by no one at all, her neighborhood razed, her house now a blackened patch of earth. There were whispers of shame, of dishonor, of surrender. A few neighbors refused to make eye contact. One woman overheard someone mutter, "Better they had died than returned like this." She said nothing, just held the letter from her sister tighter in her pocket, the one that had crossed oceans with her, unread but never forgotten. They did not speak of the camp. Not really. What would they say? That the enemy served them breakfast? That cowboys played them music? That the guards called them ma'am and handed them soap wrapped in kindness? No one would believe it. It would sound like delusion, like betrayal. So they said little. They said they survived. They left out the warmth. They left out the laughter. They left out the harmonica songs under the stars, and the taste of gravy on biscuits, and the way a man who never learned their language still learned their names. But the silence didn't erase it. They knew. In the quiet moments, washing clothes by hand or walking through what remained of their neighborhoods, it would return, not as guilt anymore, but as clarity. They had seen a world beyond the one they were told to serve, a world where mercy lived inside uniforms, where dignity was not a weakness, where enemies could be human. And once you've seen that, truly seen it, you cannot unsee it. It showed up in small rebellions. A woman who insisted her son bow to no flag but speak to every stranger with respect. Another who gave food to an American orphan in the post-war sprawl of Yokohama, even as others turned away. Some never remarried, some never spoke of the war again. Others told their stories, quietly, carefully, to daughters who listened with wide eyes and hands that didn't yet know shame. Years passed. The war faded into textbooks. The cities rebuilt themselves with steel and blinking lights. But deep in the memory of these women, now older, some now gone, there lived a moment that no bomb could erase. The morning they sat at a long wooden table in the middle of Texas and were served eggs and bacon by a man in a cowboy hat who smiled like it was the most natural thing in the world. They were prisoners of war, and yet, somehow, they were treated like people. It didn't undo the pain, it didn't erase the loss, but it planted something in them, something that grew in silence, like a tree rooted in stone. It was not forgiveness, not forgetting. It was just knowing. Knowing that war lies, that hate shrinks the world, and that dignity, once tasted, is a hunger that never leaves you. If this story moved you, give it a thumbs up and leave a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. Thank you for being here, for remembering with us.